Hello, everyone. My name is Zainab WILLIAMS-ADEYANJU from the Department of Economics, Epoka University, Tirana, Albania. I will be sharing the findings of my research on energy crisis and the role of monetary policies with you today. This is my table of contents, starting from the introduction to the research questions, timeline of energy crisis, up to the recommendations. The global energy price was fairly low up until the exit of Bretton Woods system, which led to a series of events leading to oil price shocks. The high inflation rates that resulted from domestic economy from the crisis led the governments of domestic economies through the central banks to introduce conventional and unconventional monetary policies to mitigate the adverse effects of the crisis on the financial institutions. This paper analyzes the role and effectiveness of these policies at ensuring stability and mitigating the impacts of the crisis on households and businesses. The research questions. The first research question is, what is the effectiveness of the monetary policies at ensuring reasonable price stability in the economy? The second question is, how severe is the impact of higher energy prices on living standards of people? And thirdly, I will be checking if the stage of economic development of a country affect the effectiveness of monetary policy objectives. This is the timeline of energy crisis, starting from the 1973 Arab supply cuts from Arab countries, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Iraq and Kuwaiti War, 1990, up until the most recent one, Russia and Ukraine War. Issue of energy crisis, as shown on the time series shown earlier. The first was caused by cutbacks to supplies to Western countries that were perceived to be giving military support to Israel during the Yom Kippur War, which led to rise in the price of oil that led to almost quadruple the price of oil in less than 6 months. This led to the call for alternative energy sources to guide against the recurrence. It was followed by the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which also brought back the memories of 1973 and led to significantly high prices of oil due to higher demands and lower supplies of oil. The war between two fellow member OPEC countries, Iraq and Kuwait, during the Gulf War in 1990, also led to significant price hikes. In 2008, during the global financial crisis, there were also a series of unrests, especially in the Arab Spring and the other domestic economies, which also led to significantly high oil prices. The emergence of COVID-19 pandemic and its attendant lockdowns in 2020 also led to another series of oil crisis, but this time around, this was different from the one we used to experience before. This was a lower price of oil due to lower demand and high supply of oil, but there was much more lower demand due to close down of factories and industries and essential businesses that needed the uses oil. Finally, the most recent case is that of Russia and Ukraine, which led to sanctions of Russia and led to huge cutback of supply of gas to Europe and a frightening gap in the supply and demand of gas across Europe. This is a graphical analysis of the world energy price from 1950 up to recently, 2022. The blue lines show the crude oil prices, while the orange line shows the natural gas prices. We can see from the blue lines that there were significantly stable oil prices from the 1950s up until 1973, where the price first moved up. Like I said, as a result of the cutbacks from Arab countries to the Western economies. From then, we started seeing fluctuations in the prices of oil. Sometimes they are higher prices, and sometimes we have lower prices. If we look at that of natural gas, it was fairly stable until the Russian war, which led to high prices of natural gas as a result of cutbacks from Russia. Governments have implemented conventional and unconventional monetary policies to mitigate the effects of this on the economy. The conventional monetary policies that were implemented by central banks to control the supply of money in circulation include interest rate, open market operations, and currency valuation. Also, the inflation targeting monetary policy was widely adopted by central banks to combat the energy crisis and to reduce the impact on financial institutions. The unconventional monetary policies were also introduced when it was noticed that there were ineffectiveness in the low interest rate targeting conventional monetary policy. And then the central banks introduced unconventional monetary policies including quantitative easing, qualitative easing, and credit easing to stimulate economic growth. There were similarities between the policies implemented by European Central Bank, which is the ECB, and the Federal Reserve System, the Fed, during the global economic crisis. During the initial stages of the global economic crisis in 2007, similar policies were implemented across the Atlantic. The ECB, the Fed, and the Bank of England all responded to the crisis by introducing low interest rates. They also all introduced the expansion of credit facilities to financial institutions, and there was quantitative easing through asset purchases funded by central bank. The differences in policies implemented by these banks was also that while the Fed continued with lending very little funds to banks at low interest rates, which is known as quantitative easing, the ECB was more generous at lending huge amounts to weak banks. This is credit easing to minimize the credit risk of banks in the Eurozone. This was done for banks that were close to insolvency. Another difference is that while Fed was purchasing risk-free assets like government-guaranteed bonds to stimulate the economy, the ECB, on the other hand, bought some risky assets. The monetary policies of the Fed was focused on stimulating economic activity, while the actions of the ECB were geared towards stability of the financial systems. Consequences of the policies that were implemented. For the conventional monetary policies, the low interest rates inflation targeting policy was widely adopted by central banks and were seemingly successful results in developed economies until the low interest rate prompted investors to reduce capital holding and increase their appetite for asset acquisition. This thereby led to debt accumulation and showed the effectiveness of this policy and led to the implementation of new policy instruments, which were referred to as the unconventional monetary policies. This also came with its disadvantages. The consequence of the unconventional monetary policy was evident in the over-bloated balance sheets of the central banks. As their total assets increased, these bloated balance sheets may also result in the loss of confidence in the country's currency, making it difficult to precisely determine the effectiveness of the policy. The impact of the energy crisis on households and businesses are shown here. The monetary policies implemented by central banks to alleviate the energy crisis were successful, especially in developed economies. And most importantly, they favored more investors rather than households. But the negative impacts of the energy crisis on households include high cost of living, frequent power outages, inadequate heating and cooling, loss of jobs, fuel rationing. And on businesses, the impacts include debt accumulation, reduction of outputs, and total shutdown of businesses. Findings and conclusions. Findings from this study reveal that although monetary policies at various stages have mitigated economic recessions and ensured stability of financial system, however, the low interest rate policies is not sufficient to bring about the needed objectives of price stability and sustainable output level. Also, the quantitative easing and credit easing on conventional monetary policy is also without its deficiencies in terms of undue expansion of central banks' balance sheets. The persistent energy crisis may lead to humanitarian crisis if not properly handled, as the impact of household could translate to loss of livelihoods and even deaths in extreme cases, as seen in the case of Europe. Also, the economic structure and openness of an economy is a factor affecting the type and effectiveness of monetary policies to be adopted. While the unconventional policies appear to be appropriate for developed economies, they were not enough to stimulate economies of the developed economies and developing economies and emerging economies. Recommendations. An overview of a series of global energy crises has highlighted the vulnerability of global markets to exogenous shocks and has led to a shift in economic power from the G7 economies to the oil-producing Arab economies. For economic security, governments should look in the direction of self-sufficiency and seek alternative sources in renewables and unconventional sources. Governments of developing countries, especially, should also increase the funding of oil exploration and production to boost their own capacity and reduce their reliance. Better regulation of the energy sector is also advocated to avoid market manipulations that could shift the burden totally on consumers. The calls for exit strategies from unconventional policies must follow a coordinated and gradual process, considering the peculiarities in the structure of global economies and the variance in the impact of oil price uncertainty on the real economies. Thank you for listening.